Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Danielle Slakoff and I am really excited to share with you some of my newest research. My co-author on this piece is Dr. Hank Fridella. He is currently in the School of Criminology at Arizona State University, and I will be at Sacramento State University come fall 2020. So this piece is open access, meaning that anybody can Google the title of this piece and find it. You do not need to be logged in at a library or be university affiliated. So please Google the name of this if you would like to read the actual paper. Okay, so this is actually something that came from my master's thesis. So when I was a master's student, I was fascinated by missing persons cases and specifically about missing women. And I was constantly watching the news and focusing on cases like this. And what I noticed is that it was very, very difficult to actually find stories about missing minority women. So that's kind of where this whole project started. So at the time, Dr. Fridella and I were both at Cal State Long Beach, and he was my thesis mentor, and he really helped me turn this into a research project. And basically wanted to look at, are there differences between how missing white people are portrayed, missing white women specifically, and missing minority women. So these are just some examples of some high profile cases. I want to keep the time down, but these were some of the names that came to mind. And I find that students really struggle to figure out or even come up with one name of a missing minority person, but it's usually much easier to name a missing white woman. Okay, so first of all, there needs to be this understanding of the fact that the US media definitely tries to maximize ratings. The reason they do that is because advertising dollars often come from the amount of clicks or the amount of viewers or readers that they have. And so there's definitely this need to maximize ratings. And so what I've noticed is that other than, celebrity news and news about, for example, natural disasters or pandemics, there tends to be this focus on missing white women and white children. And so the media does tend to latch on to these mega cases because they enjoy relative longevity in the media and because audience members often have a very strong response to these types of stories. And so what I've noticed and what research suggests is that missing white women and white girls tend to be in a category all of their own, and that the media tends to glorify these missing women and missing girls, but to ignore missing minority women and girls. So the missing white woman syndrome, it's not a new term, but that is the term that you need to understand for this project. It's basically just this overwhelming focus on missing white people and specifically on missing white women and girls. I think when we talk about what does this look like in practice, I think that Megan's Law is a really good representation of this, and Hank and I make that argument in our paper. We basically state that the missing white woman syndrome has definitely distorted the way that people view missing persons cases, and people believe that white women and girls are actually the most at risk when that's not true. So for those of you who don't know about Megan's Law was named after Megan Conca. She was a young girl who was brutally raped and murdered by her sex offender neighbor, who was recently or somewhat recently released from prison. And this case did receive nationwide media attention. There was huge outrage, and New Jersey actually enacted this law named Megan's Law. And this made sex offenders' residency and work addresses public. And so many of you may have gone onto the Megan's Law website in your own states if you're based in the US. People talk about the fact that Megan's Law is very controversial, not only because it's expensive to upkeep the registry, but because Megan's Law really masks the greater danger that is within people's homes. So to put that another way, it's very uncommon to be attacked by a stranger, and it's much more common to be attacked by someone within your own home, whether a friend or a relative. And so many people say that this law kind of puts this onus or this fear onto the stranger, when the reality is that the danger often comes within our own homes. And so we make the argument that Megan's Law is just one example of how powerful the media is in really shaping public sentiment around missing people. And we are actually argued that this misrepresentation is a moral panic. Okay, so I'm not going to go too much into the mass communications theory here because this is primarily for sociology, criminology, as well as women's studies classes. So I'm going to focus here on the bottom theory, which is critical race feminism. So critical race feminist scholars basically argue that the experiences of white women and girls are going to be different than the experiences of minority women and girls. While both groups will face sexism because they are women and girls, only the minority women will also face double marginality because they'll also be facing racism. So that's essentially what this critical race feminism means. We basically argued that because of critical race feminism, we did expect there to be differential treatment between the two groups. So what did we actually do? We looked at 11 different newspapers, or excuse me, news stories from 11 different newspapers over 4 years using content analysis. And we were specifically interested in A, whether we continued to perpetuate the missing white woman syndrome, and B, if there were other factors other than race, such as age, occupation, and motherhood status, that could affect story narrative. So those were our two primary goals. So if you look here at the second line, missing Black girls and women accounted for about 20% of news stories in our sample, even though they are estimated to account for 33.84% of missing people altogether. This disparity of more than 14 percentage points demonstrates that the media definitely continues to underreport stories about missing Black women and missing Black girls. But conversely, if you look at the top line, missing white girls and women are overrepresented in news stories by 8.81%. And interestingly, missing women and girls from other racial backgrounds are similarly overrepresented at 8.63%. So just to move right into the findings, because that's where the good stuff is, I believe. As you can see here, yes, first of all, we did see this overrepresentation and that stayed true. But we were very interested and very surprised to find that missing Black women and girls were actually more likely to have their legitimate jobs described in their stories than their white counterparts. And we argued that these mentions of their legitimate employment might have been used as an attempt to humanize them and to make them seem like their disappearance was really negative for society at large. So for example, I'm going to actually read this because I don't want to screw it up. There was a 2017 story about a Black woman named Regina Williams. In the story, and this is a quote, she was described as one of the best social workers in the profession and was credited for inspiring a friend's decision to become a social worker herself, end quote. So given this description, people who read this were probably pretty likely to feel sympathy for Miss Williams and recognize that she was a high-functioning member of society who contributed to the world around her, inspired others to go into social work. So this description of a Black missing woman or Black missing girls as productive members of society really illustrate that their loss is important to society. So probably not as surprising is the fact that missing girls under the age of 13 were significantly more likely to be described as innocent, which we stated was not all that surprising given the fact that innocence is very commonly linked to childhood. We did find that women between the ages of 18 and 29 were significantly more likely to have mentions of consensual sex or sexuality present in their stories, and they were more likely in this age group to be described as sex workers as well. So stories about women ages 18 to 29 were more likely to mention this consensual sex or sexuality. We found this on one hand to be unsurprising because we know that this is the given age range that many people become sexually active. But of course, it's important to point out that teenagers, as well as women over the age of 30, are also sexual beings, but they are not described in that same way. And it's also important to point out that sexuality is not evil or immoral in any way, but yet this theme was often portrayed in very negative ways. For example, as someone who is sexually acting out, or as the other woman in an affair. And so while these descriptions might be factual, it might be factual that this missing woman was the other woman in an affair, we argue that it could be used to delegitimize this person's plight. Okay, so another thing that we found is that these missing women or girls who had the lawful jobs or the legitimate jobs were significantly more likely to have their innocence mentioned as well. And as discussed earlier, I think job status is used as a humanizing factor. Moreover, women age 30 and older were significantly more likely to be described as mothers. Once again, may not be that surprising, but it definitely is a very common theme that, you know, we need to find this person because they have kids at home waiting for them. We also found some interesting differences across region. The one I would like to point out here is that stories from the South were significantly more likely to describe the missing person as a mother. We believe that this might come from the fact that in the South, the percentage of evangelical Christians who tend to emphasize this conformity to gender roles and to traditional family is at least 8 percentage points higher than in other regions. So we think that because the South, there is this focus on family and motherhood, that it's not that surprising that we see this change. Okay, so across all of the stories, and there were 194 total, white missing women and girls received the most repeated coverage. And I think that this does a really good job of showing that. So important to see here, 19 missing women or girls had 2 or more stories written about them in the data set, and 16 of those missing women or girls were white. So when we talk about only 19 women or girls had repeat stories, 16 of them were white. So it just shows how common this repeated attention is, specifically for white missing females. I also think that it's important to point out that very few people had more than 2 stories written about them. And you can see here that the people that did have more than 2 stories written about them tended to be white as well. Okay, so what does this all mean? So we argue that, of course, the media needs to continue to address the missing white woman syndrome and the fact that we are commoditizing news means that they're very likely to keep focusing on things that garner high ratings. I think this quote is so important. This was an anonymous news reporter who said, "We showcase missing white attractive women because our research shows that we get more viewers and it is about beating the competition and garnering ad dollars." So put another way, white women and girls are still viewed as the ideal victim and they are still getting the most attention. So what do we argue at the end of this? We argue that we need to dismantle the missing white woman syndrome in order to discover how we can make missing minority women's stories more profitable to the media. We also think it's important to point out that it appears the media is just another avenue in our society that puts the needs of white victims and their families first. And then finally, with regard to these positive portrayals, we argued that the media humanized missing women and girls via descriptions of their motherhood, their innocence and purity, as well as their job status. And although assumptions about acceptable female behavior are under much scrutiny and even critique, it's interesting to note that the favorable portrayals that we found were very much in line with traditional ideals about what a woman or girl should be in the United States. In our study, it seemed like the good, in quotes, the good missing women and girls were those who had had children, who maintained their sexual purity and were not having consensual sex, and were the people who gained legitimate employment and therefore were giving back to society. Okay, so I hope you found this interesting. Please look up the article if you'd like to hear more, and I hope you all have a great day.